Hi, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our third installment of our EGI Spring webinar series. So today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Joseph Moore, and he's going to be giving us an overview of the Utah Frontier Observatory for Research in Geothermal Energy, also known as Utah Forge. He is the managing principal investigator of the Utah Forge project. So with that, I see a few people are still joining, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So I will hand it off to Dr. Joseph Moore.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here today and to talk a bit about our Forge project. Forge is unique worldwide. It is the only field scale laboratory in the world designed specifically to create and test new technologies and de-risk them. The goal is not to produce electricity here. And this is an important distinction. I'd like to acknowledge the DOE for providing the funding for this and all of our contributors, particularly Dr. John McClellan, who has been instrumental, but also our drill site managers and the entire team. So let's get started, take a look at what Forge is about. Oh. All right. Conventional geothermal systems span a relatively broad range of pressures or depths and temperatures, and they're constrained by the global average gradient. We use 25 degrees C per kilometer, and the boiling point to depth curve. Typically, drilling is limited to depths of 3 to 4 kilometers, just because permeabilities tend to decrease and economics isn't favorable to us. Enhanced geothermal systems, and we'll use that term rather than others at this point, are characterized by very low permeabilities. And so the goal for EGS is to create the permeability where none exists naturally. And typically these are at greater depths than the conventional systems, the flash planted binary systems, but the temperatures overlap. One of the driving forces most recently has been DOE's Earthshot 4. Let me explain that a bit. And this was announced in 2023, but EGS goes back much further than that. The US currently produces 3,700 megawatts. That's good, but not great. And DOE's Earthshot program called for 60, sometimes it's 90 megawatts of electric energy by 2050, and to reduce the cost of EGS by 90% to $45 per megawatt hour. These are huge asks to go from 3,700 to 60,000 even. It's not going to be simple. And if we look at the available, say, conventional geothermal systems or hydrothermal geothermal systems, these are always associated with hot springs. There's just not possible to go from 3,700 to 60,000 within a few years. So what it requires is the creation of geothermal reservoirs where none exists naturally. And Jeff Tester and others in 2006 noted that tapping even 2% of the energy between 2 and 6 miles would provide more than 2,000 times yearly US needs. And if you take nothing else away from this presentation, remember what Jeff and his team worked on. On the right, you see a map of the US. This is at 4 kilometers. but I think it's 4 miles, 6 kilometers. Anything that is this yellow, green, red, that's suitable for electric generation, about 300 F150C. So virtually the entire country is suitable for EGS development. Okay. Obviously, it's not a new idea. The first experiments were done at Fenton Hill in the 70s, and we've seen tests in virtually all of the major countries that generate electricity in the world, and a number of them more recently. What's important to recognize, these were generally vertical holes or slightly deviated holes. These holes were uncased through the production zones. And none produce more than a few megawatts. I think Schultz now, most of you are aware of that, maybe a megawatt and a half, 1.7 megawatts. We're looking at 5+ megawatts, ideally more than that. They produce sub-economic flows. I'll just put 40 liters per second as economic, somewhere around 600 gallons a minute. Like to see 80 to 100 or more liters per second. But we'll set the bar fairly low. These systems have yielded very low heat recoveries based on tracer data, just a few percent. Some of these systems have yielded unacceptable levels of induced seismicity. You're familiar with many of those, I'm sure. Pohang in particular, Basel in Switzerland. And so that's a critical issue. And finally, the flow from fractures in these systems, and we're looking at hydraulically stimulated sites with high temperatures, typically a granite reservoir. We're not looking at, say, acid improvement of carbonates or hybrid systems here. What we find is that the fractures that produce fluid are the fractures that were present when the wells were drilled, and these are demonstrated by cool zones during drilling. Okay, so we really critically haven't been able to develop these integrated fracture systems capable of long-term circulation. And when we talk about long-term, we're talking 15 years plus, and we haven't demonstrated that yet. I'm pleased that there are companies right now that are actively engaged in EGS, and we'll see how those turn out in the near future. This is a map of the Fort site. You see it's in southwestern Utah. It's at the margin between the Basin and Range and the Colorado Plateau or stable continent. What we see on the left is the Blundell Power Plant. This is an active power plant. It's been producing since 1984, first developed in the Basin and Range, and it produces 36 megawatts. To the west of that is the Fort site. You'll see the 7 wells that we have drilled. Further to the west are 168 windmills with a total capacity of 306 megawatts. They produce about 75 megawatts. They run maybe 25% of the time. And then to the west of that is a solar field, again with a similar output. What you don't see are the hog farms. You'll see them in some of the later figures. And the gas from the hog farms was enriched methane, and it was injected into a natural gas pipeline, which is located just east of the 78B32 well. The area is really perfect site for EGS. As you can see, there's no farming here. This is desert, but there's no habitation, there's no farming, there's no agriculture. And there are no endangered species. The reason that there's no human activity is because the groundwater, which occurs at 500 to 1,000 feet, is not potable because of its composition. It is in fact, outflow from the Roosevelt Hot Spring geothermal system of the Blundell power plants, natural outflow. And so the state has decreed that it's not potable and can't be used for human or animal consumption. Let's take a look at the geology. It's very interesting. On the right, we see the green rocks. These are granites. These are 28 to 11 million year old granites, and they form part of the reservoir. The pinks and reds are quaternary rhyolites. These are 750,000 years old. They're related to a still cooling intrusion that underlies this area. Further to the west are the blues and the grays. These are gneiss, Precambrian gneisses, 1.7 billion years old, and they're sillimanite grade. West of that, we see the Fort site. On the right-hand side, you see a cross section. Basins and ranges in the Basin and Range province are characterized by nearly vertical structures that separate the basins from the ranges. And in this case, that structure has been rotated down to the east. And that's the contact you see between the sheared granitoid and the basin fill, which laps onto the granitoid horizontally. That Basin and range structure is locked at this orientation. And seismic studies have shown no major offsets of the basin fill and the basement rocks. The basement rocks continue to the east upslope along the front of the mountain range. You can see temperatures that have been measured here. There are two other important structures on the map. One is labeled the Opal Mound Fault, and the other is the Mag-Lee Fault. The Opal Mound Fault ends in a sinter deposit at its southern end, and at a steaming ground at its northern end, and it's intersected by the Mag-Lee Fault. This is a major hydraulic barrier. We have tried to image it. It has about 15 meters of displacement, but we have been unable to see it in the granites. It seems to be a near vertical structure. It's controlled hot spring deposits in the past. To the east of the Opal Mound Fault, the wells that you see, 1310, 28.3, these wells are vertical and they have convective gradients with temperatures initially up to about 250 C. On the west side of the Opal Mound Fault, 9-1 is a good example. All of the forge wells are conductive gradients, indicating that there is no permeability or very limited permeability in these rocks, ideal EGS. It also acts as a pressure barrier, the Opal Mound Fault, with about 30 bars of pressure difference across that zone. But the reality is we don't understand what has produced the Opal Mound Fault, why it's there. There have been suggestions that outpourings of rhyolite, these QRs that you see on the map, emptied a chamber, and that chamber has formed a half graben bounded by Opal Mound and Mag-Lee faults. Right. The reservoir rocks are varied. I think we can say that they're all high strength, high moduli. They're abrasive, they're hot, and they have low permeabilities. Measured permeabilities are on the range of 30 to 80 microdarcies. The two pictures on the right are some of the metamorphic rocks. You can see the defolding in them. And then on the left are the granitic rocks. I think it's appropriate to say that these are pretty typical. Fractures are very minimal in these rocks. They have very, very low permeability in natural fractures. And that is one of the issues we we still are raising. We see many fractures in formation microimager logs, but we don't see them in the core. And it's a question of whether they actually exist in the rock or they're primarily induced fractures. Okay. We've drilled 7 wells to date. The project started in 2014. We drilled the first well in 2016 as a test well. That was well 5832 on the left. I'm not going to worry about that. And subsequently, since we were awarded the project in 2018 and drilled the remainder of the wells. In the background, you can see the windmills extending 7 miles to the east, and the hog farms, most of which are now empty. If we look at these wells, 6832 is a 1,000-foot well, and it contains a permanent 3-component seismometer and accelerometer. 78B, 5632, and 5832 are primarily monitoring wells, monitoring for seismicity. The deepest of these is 78B, 9,500 feet. You can see on the right at the star, we haven't measured it directly, but estimate a temperature of about 240 degrees C. Temperatures simply increase with depth. And up on the top, you see a little bit of a perturbation near 1,000 feet, and that's the groundwater table. There is a water well at 5832 that we've drilled, and it supplies all of our water at this point. 16A and 16B are the injection and production well. They were drilled vertically to 4,000 to 5,000 feet, deviated 65 degrees from vertical, and they followed the trajectory shown by the white and the red lines. A has about 200 feet of open hole. B has about 700 feet of open hole. And we'll talk more about that. These 2 wells were just stimulated this April very, very successfully. The 2 wells are separated vertically by about 300 feet, but they follow similar trajectories. The reason that these wells are drilled to the southeast is because they were drilled parallel to the minimum horizontal stress. One of the very early activities was understanding the stress field, the stress directions, and that was a particular goal of 5832. We did a number of FMI logs, image logs. The Opal Mound fault, if you remember that, is approximately SH max, and so we are drilling perpendicular to that to take advantage of the stress field. These wells were both cased. I have to say that's a first in the geothermal community. They have 7-inch production casing. B16B 7832 also has 3 fiber optic cables in it for seismic monitoring. Let's talk a little bit about what's been done. Then we'll go on to what we plan to do in the next months. So this is one of the flow tests. You can see the steam coming out of the separator. Okay. In April of 2022, we had just completed the well A, 16A32. You can read the injection strategy here, but the goal of that was to monitor seismicity during the stimulation to assess the extent of the seismic cloud, and that was important because we learned from the first EGS test, the hot dry rock at Fenton Hill program, that it's better to drill one well, determine the stress field and the location of the seismic cloud, than to drill your production and injection well and then hope you can connect them. And that was significant learning at Fenton Hill. They don't connect easily. And so here the idea was to understand that stress field, understand where the seismic events were, because certainly the reservoir would be in the fractured rocks. This was a modest stimulation program, 50 barrels per minute in the open hole, and then 35 barrels per minute. This was a first here as well, because the two lower stimulations, stage 2 and stage 3, the two upper ones, were done in a cased well, perforated through casing. It was successful, and we also looked at slick water versus a cross-linked phosphide fluid. Okay. Seismic monitoring has been absolutely critical throughout this because of the problems that we've seen worldwide. And very early on, we set up a seismic monitoring network. On the left, you see two rings. Each of the rings contains, I think, 4 post-hole seismometers, three component seismometers at a depth of about 100 feet. So it's a ring at 3 kilometers, a ring at 8 kilometers. And these are dominantly for hazard monitoring, critical. The nearest town is Milford, about 15 miles away. But as I mentioned, we have a geothermal plant just to our right, in fact, on the 3-kilometer line, and we have the wind farm and the solar field. So monitoring seismicity is absolutely critical. There are several groups of seismic events. The one most significant to us, you can see on the upper right. The blues are dominantly injection water from the plant, so mostly shallower. But as you move to the east into these oranges and yellows, they get deeper. They form part of a swarm zone that was identified in 1980, and it's approximately parallel to that Magley Fault. We find no evidence the Magley Fault continues or extends into Forge. On the map, you also see a grazed area just outside of the 8-kilometer zone, and these are related to tectonic events. There are other events related to a quarry, but magnitude 4s are not uncommon in the Milford area. During operations, we augment the surface monitoring system with nodal arrays. These last about 30 days, and here you can see one of the nodes being buried at just a few feet. Okay. Within the main part, the central part of the Fort site, we've been using deeper geophones. Ideally, the first tests were done at reservoir depths, plus or minus about 200 degrees C. So it's a very challenging environment for geophones, and they don't last very long. But from the right to the left, this is an analog geophone made by Avalon. Then we have an 8-level string. This is digital, 3 components. We've used both Avalon and Schlumberger. Further to the left, you see fiber optic string with 3-component geophones on them. We're testing that right now, just the wireline. This, in my opinion, is the wave of the future. These fiber optic strings have an incredible tolerance to temperature, and I'll again mention that. And in well B that we drilled, the production well, which was finished just winter, I think in January of 23, and just stimulated last month, we for the first time ran 3 fiber optic strings, one a Silixa string, one a shell pack, and then a PT fiber optic string at the heel of the well. The goal here was to monitor strain, temperature, and seismicity. The first test, and I'd like to show you the results of the first test. It's interesting. On the left, we'll play a movie in a few seconds, and you'll see the red is stage 1, open hole. Green is stage 2, cased hole, slick water, and the blue is the cased hole, viscosified fluid. So zone 1, the diamonds are the perfs. Now we're seeing second stimulation. And now we'll rotate it. So the third stimulation produced a very flat, narrow fracture zone. It's been interpreted as a hydraulic fracture. One of the questions is, what is the role of natural fractures in this? On the right, see several fractures that encompass many of the seismic events, with a few that have no seismic events that may serve as bridging. And this is maybe a simplified DFN that our team has put together. If you recall, one of the major goals was to determine what the seismic cloud looks like, so that we could locate the trajectory of the production well. And that's the pink well that you see here. It hadn't been drilled at the time that we did this stimulation. So we saw seismic events 150, maybe 200 meters away. When we did this stimulation, plus 0.5 to minus 2.3. So nothing sensible. In 2024, just this month, in fact, just about a week ago, we completed the second stimulation. This was a large-scale stimulation that was done between A and B. We'll go through the details in a minute. What we're looking at here are the site 5832 is off to your left, 2 harpoon tanks, and then 2 more harpoon tanks, these big tanks filled with water. On the 16 AB pad, the 2 rigs, we used 2 workover rigs simultaneously for the stimulation. The green and the blue pits hold, I think it's 175,000 barrels of water. And this water is coming out of a water well between the 2 harpoon tanks to the left. Okay? The pit in the middle was dug by Fervo and provides water to them for their project, which is just west of us. Okay, we used frac pumps, and you can see them next to our silos, and just to the right of the further well. They were provided by CalFrac. This was an interesting test, and like all of our work, and as I mentioned very early on, the goal is to de-risk technologies and tools. So it's not to drill the fastest, it's not to stimulate the fastest, it's not to create the greatest number of clusters. It really is to test tools and technologies. So what you see here are the 2 wells, 16A, 16B on top of it, and the various frac stages. We refracked stage 1, 2, and 3. That was the original 3 fracs in well A. And then we continue with fracs 4 through 10. We tested proppants. There were no proppants in the first test we did. and these were silica sand proppants. We tested bridge plugs, and I'll show you those in a minute. Bridge plugs at these temperatures have a nasty habit of failing. But we've had extremely good success with the bridge plugs we need. We tested the number of clusters, right? In the first test we did, single cluster. So one set of perforations per stage. Here we're looking at sets of perforations or clusters. In stage 7, you see 4 separated by 50 feet. In stage 8, you see 8 clusters separated by 25 feet. Same in 9, and then 1 cluster in 10. The 8 and 9 provide a comparison of slick water versus a viscosified fluid. And they also provide information compared to stage 7 of whether pressure shadowing is an issue that we have to deal with. And so that's the reason that you see this kind of variation. We tried in stage 6 ultralight proppant. We were not able to break the rock down significantly, and so stage 10 was a repeat of that. The treating fluids, as I mentioned, slick water versus viscosified fluid. This is the first I'm aware of 3 fiber optic cables monitoring strain, temperature, and seismicity, or DAS, simultaneously. The fiber optic cables were cemented in the annulus of the 7-inch production string. Extremely valuable. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think one of the lessons is fiber optic cables may be inexpendable, but they're absolutely critical in monitoring geothermal systems. Okay. Stage 9 was one of the larger stages, but the patterns that you see here are very typical. This was an 8 cluster stage. You can see we stabilized rate of 80 barrels per minute. And in our initial test that we had done, we were looking at 50 barrels per minute as a maximum, with 35 barrels per minute in the cased hole. You see the sand that was used. If we look at the graph, treating pressure is in red, bottom hole pressure is black. And these are very, very typical pressure trends for all of them. And then the slurry rate, blender rate, you can see on the right-hand side. So pressure increased, stimulated, pressure remained relatively constant until toward the end. I think this was a 7-hour stage when they started to increase the pressures, and screen out was becoming an issue, and so the test was stopped. But here again, very, very successful. What I'd like to do is illustrate here now the seismicity. It's you've seen what it looks like in single stages. We have a much more complicated seismic pattern here. This was monitored by Geoenergy Swiss, and we had geophones in the 3 deep wells. We had surface arrays of nodals. We had the fork well, which was a 1,000-foot well with a geophone and accelerometer. What we learned from our first tests and multiple tests after that is it's very difficult to keep geophones running at temperatures of 200 degrees C. They just don't work for long periods of time. Some of them we've had failures at as short as 4 days. In this case, we ran 2 strings, Schlumberger string, an Avalon string, and a analog string in the 3 wells, with the maximum temperature being 150 degrees C, about 300. And they did quite well at those temperatures. In fact, the longest string lasted about a month, which I think is exceptional. We need to develop these optic fibers, and we do, in fact, have one at depth in a well now, just to seeing how it's working. The lower histogram shows you the time scale for each of the stages and the color for each of the stage. So I'm a little colorblind, but this funky green on the left is the refract, and the very dark green on the right is stage 10. The orange balls are events that are greater than 0.6 to 0.9. The black balls are magnitudes of 1 to 1.9. We had no magnitudes over 1.9, which would have at a 2, we initiate our traffic light system, which looks at number for green, looks at 2s, and then looks at 3s, and ultimately leads to a shutdown. So that traffic light system was followed during all of our stimulations. This is a static view. You can see basically looking north through all of the stages, and then looking vertically down on it. Draw your attention to stages 7, 8, 9, and 10. Those are the upper stages. The vertical wells are our monitoring wells, so you can see they're well placed. And what you see here is that the larger events occur at the margins of the stimulated zone, and that you find that it's very difficult to make or distinguish number 7, which is some of this magenta, from stage 8, which is red, from stage 9, from stage 10, which is green. So purple to green, and the greens primarily occur on the very ends of this. So there seems to be overlapping of these stages, despite a relatively significant separation between them. And let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. Okay, I'd like to show a video here. Again, this is, I don't know, 10,000 plus events. So here we go. 1, 2. I think if you squint, you can see planes here. Again, a question is, what is the role of natural fractures versus hydraulic fractures? You see a tendency in the upper fracts to overlap. What's a bit different here than we saw before is height versus depth are about the same, and width is about the same. So a relatively circular cloud of seismic events. We monitored strain. It's been done off and on a few times. I'm aware of a few. It's done in the oil and gas industry. Certainly not done routinely, and this may be the only second time I'm aware of that, the strain data. But it's incredible strain data. What we're looking at here is on the left, stage 8, followed by stage 9. You see the pressure trends, followed by stage 10. The fracts are the strain, the reds are the strain fronts of positive strain. And the x-axis is time. The vertical axis is depth. And what you see with time is movement of that strain front For example, um, between stages 8 and 9, you'd see a strain front when there was no stimulation going on. See the strain fronts moving to the right in stage 8, which is the first stage. Stage 9, then again, we see stray fronts coming in after the initial fronts. And finally, in stage 10, you see what appears to be overlap of the strain front with the previous two. These strain hits were used to locate the perforations in the production well. And so it was really critical to be able to obtain this data, and it was obtained by Nubrex Energy. And we'll provide a report on this when all of the data is analyzed. But very, very useful data. We were fortunate. We did lose about 400 feet of the fiber optic cable. It ran from about I think 10,200 feet or so to surface. We had erosion during perforation stimulation, and so we lost a few hundred feet. But despite that, we were able to keep the fiber intact through all of the perforation stimulations in A and B. B was also stimulated. There were 4 fracs, 4 stages and 5 perforations in B. I think one of the lessons we've learned is and others have noticed it, you frac both wells. And so that's why it was critical to locate those frac points in B. Okay, here's another strain diagram. It's not entirely clear. We did run FMI logs, but we were not able to get good data in B because of some issues with lubricators. Nevertheless, if we look at the strain data, it's pretty compelling. What you see on the spiky histogram coming from B are relative magnitudes of the strain. On the data before, and this is during the circulation test, okay? What you saw prior to this was on the stimulations. Now we're looking at the circulation, and you can see these Nike stripes, and there's suggestion here that these strains, these positive strains are extending from the very early clusters, from that very deep stage, all through stage 10. We expect that majority of the fluid will be entering the injection well through the uppermost stages. These were the largest stages, very effective stages, overlap of stages. But it looks here like we're seeing production from the entire well. 6, you can see, was the stage that did not stimulate well. There's a geologic change between the gneisses and interbedded gneisses, interlayered gneisses and granites, and it occurred about stage 6, and it looked like it just was a strained shadow. Okay. One other point, I'm going to go back here, is that stage 10, we injected about 4,000 barrels. It was very typical to those stages 1, 2, and 3 in the initial 16A frac. But what was interesting is that we produced more than 4 times the amount injected into stage 10 before drilling out the plugs. So we flowed back, we had to flow back to reduce pressures and drill out the plugs, but we produced more than 4 times, more than 16,000 barrels. I don't know what the actual number is. I've heard much higher. And that implies that we had very good connections between stage 10 and the other nearby stages, since it continued to flow for many, many days. This is the circulation test. This was approximately a 9-hour test at the end of the stimulation. And so we have here the discharge temperature on the left in red in Fahrenheit. We have the injection rate and the discharge rate. Okay. The injection rate stabilized at about 13 barrels per minute. We recovered in blue about 8 or so barrels per minute. This is good. This is about 70% recovery. We see that both the discharge rate and the temperature are continuing to increase, and the test was shut off before they fully stabilized. We returned to maximum temperature of 282 degrees. So exceptional test. This is certainly, given the number of stages and clusters that we stimulated, commercial. We have achieved commercial production rates. Okay. Won't talk much about this. You can read it, but we used 2 different types of tracers in each of the stages. So we used a quantum dot tracers. These are stable up to 1000 C. Many of them, and we used only a small number, obviously one for each. And then we used the sulfonates by Resman as well. And so there were 2 goals to this. One, can we test these tracers and their application, and are they going to be stable? We certainly expect them to be stable, at least the quantum dots. During the circulation test, Pete Rose ran naphthalene sulfonates. And we'll see what we get out of those. We have specifically avoided radioactive tracers. Just some key observations from the stimulation. Obviously, we total fracked 10 stages. We stimulated 4 stages in the production well, but perforated 5. The reason is we didn't have more frac plugs, and we had a gun that was loaded. Rather than try to transport that gun, it was felt that the safest thing to do with it was just shoot it off in the well and not stimulate, because we had already stimulated lower in the well in that stage. Treating pressures, you can see it typically 6,500 to 7,500 PSI. I mentioned the backflow on stage 10. So 2 unique tracers. The tracers are currently being analyzed, and we put on that a little bit later. Very high rates of discharge. Pressures built to about 3,400 PSI for injection pressure. We could have gone higher, but previous tests have showed that we'll reach stimulation pressure. We wanted to avoid creating any additional fractures. So the decision was to keep it below 3,400 frac gradient pressures. We see the temperature, no seismic events greater than 1.9, and there were well over 100,000 events. I only showed you 10,000, and we had little sand production. Unlike classic geothermal systems, we pumped on the injection side, produced out of the production well. Most geothermal systems will do the opposite, pump out of the production well, and then inject into the injection side where the pressures are lower. This is an interesting concept. It was pioneered by Fervo. and we're following it. And part of the reason is to avoid any sand production and pump damage. Hey, just to look very briefly at what we've done since we started the program. Obviously, we successfully stimulated our well pair using a vertical separation rather than a horizontal separation. We have worked closely with bit designers, NOV particularly, on PDC bits. I had the honor of drilling 5832, the well on the right. I was able to go 10 to 13 feet an hour, 4 meters an hour. We are now drilling using MSE calculations, and we've cut the drilling time by 50%. We're drilling on bottom times of 120 feet an hour with bit runs to over 2,000 feet per hour. So significant decrease in cost for these wells. We've tested plugs at Packers. Petroquip plug was successfully deployed. This was one of the R&D projects Forge funded. Approximately 50% of the total funding is for R&D, 50% for operations. The plug set successfully, and then after about a week, it degraded. But it was a very, very successful test. We've tested particle drilling, not widely used in the industry, and at this point, I wouldn't recommend it. Rotary steerable systems, we've tested a few of those. CSDI provided them. They provide very, very smooth holes. Bent motors produce much more rugosity, and the idea was to create as smooth a hole as possible so we could run these fiber optic cables. They need a little bit of work, but they have a lot of potential for RSSs. Mudhammer didn't give us any improvement. Insulated pipe did keep temperatures down, and that looks like that will be very useful. And then the wellhead was novel. The wellhead you saw was a 10,000 K wellhead. 10,000 wellhead. Okay, what's next? Obviously, we're going to analyze the data that we've collected, seismic strain pressure and tracer data. And in July timeframe of this year, we hope to begin a 30-day circulation test. If you're curious what these plugs look like, the one on the right is the Petroquip plug that was so successful. And one on the left is a 9 Energy Services plug. We've used a variety of other plugs before, but this plug was built specifically for us for our 38-pound 7-inch casing, and it worked very well. It worked very well. It was drillable. We drilled them out. It takes a few hours, but it worked. We will be testing electromagnetic tools from Berkeley. Clemson has strain meter out in the field. We'll see if they saw some strain at relatively shallow depths. Stanford will run a chloride monitoring tool, and I don't have time to get into it, but there are differences in chloride due to water rock interactions. And Rice is, I think, at this point running their stationary orbital vibrators, which may be a much more inexpensive way to do VSP surveys. All of the data is available through GDR, through our wiki pages. I encourage you to go to those, to look for it. If you can't find it, call me. We'll get it for you. Go to our website, a number of videos as well. So thank you. Again, thank DOE and the team who've done an incredible job. Utah Trust lands, these are state lands that our site is on, Beaver County and the governor's office, and Smithfield. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Are we taking questions or are we wrapping up?
I'm happy to take some questions. I see, let's see.
I don't, let's see, here's, I think we have a new one. Okay, we have one. Uh, can you please elaborate a bit more on the stress shadowing effect and the cluster efficiency during the stimulation at the stages with 4-8 clusters?
We're looking into that. The issue of pressure shadowing is that um, in that fracks between each other uh, will interact and will not generate. And so the question was, will we see frac generation or hydraulic generation in the 50-foot clusters? And if we use a much closer spacing, will those fractures interfere with each other, or will they grow downward? And I think from what we're seeing initially on the strain data, it looks like all of those hydraulic fractures were working. I think what we're seeing in terms of the blues and the reds, the positive and the negative strain, may be telling us that initially there may be some press shadowing and that decreases over time. And we were very successful with that. I think we had a very high proportion of hydraulic fractures generated, but we're looking at that. It says, are you using fiber optics to record temperature? And yes, the fiber optics the fiber optic tables contain one multi-mode, at least on the shell pack, and 2 single-mode fibers. The multi-mode fiber is being used to monitor temperature continuously, and we have a record of this. And then the single-mode fibers, this is an OptiSense interrogator deployed by UT Austin, and the OptiSense single mode is Seismic for DAS. On the other single mode, we have an interrogator, and the signal is split for DAS. All of the seismic data you saw was on that split signal, and on the other portion of the signal, Nubrex was monitoring strain. Silixa and Rice deployed also a fiber optic cable. Unfortunately, it didn't fare as well. But we're waiting to see what data we collected off of that. There was a question on closed loop. This project, and I'm happy to address it, but this project was designed as a hydraulic stimulation from the very beginning. And that says nothing contrary or is not critical of closed loop. In fact, personally, I would love to see this site, closed loop system tested at this site. As I mentioned, this site is really a national laboratory for de-risking tools and technologies. And we have done that. You've seen some of the drilling technologies we've tested. So we're anxious to test technologies. If there's a good closed loop system, I'd like to test it if we can. Okay. Any others?
Okay. If you're done, Joe, then we can go ahead and wrap up.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
Yes.
your attention.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today. We really appreciate it. Check our website, egi.utah.edu, for more updates on upcoming webinars. And we want to thank you again for joining. Okay. Goodbye, everyone.